South Carolina is full of places where ancient history still feels close, from shell rings older than the pyramids to mysterious mounds, rock carvings, and forgotten trade paths. The state holds clues to cultures that left only scattered traces behind. These sites raise more questions than answers, inviting you to look a little closer at the landscape and wonder who shaped it long before us. The Hagood Mill rock carving. If you walk into the woods around Hagood Mill early in the morning, before most visitors start drifting in, there's a moment where the place feels older than anything around it. The mill itself is historic, sure, but the longer you stay, the more you notice what's carved into the stone just a short walk from the main grounds. These rock carvings, sitting out in the open as if they were meant to be found by anyone who passed, make this spot feel like a doorway into a time we barely understand. They look simple at first, circles, lines, spirals, but the longer you stare, the more those shapes start to feel intentional, as if they were part of a message that never got fully translated. The rock panel isn't huge, but it's dense with symbols. Most people hear petroglyphs and imagine big scenes or figures, but the carvings at Hagood Mill are more abstract. They're mostly concentric circles and cup marks. Some are only a couple inches wide, while others stretch out with several rings. They have this quiet presence, like they were tied to something important: water, seasons, stories, maybe even the spirits that early communities believed lived in the landscape. Standing in front of them, you start wondering what these people saw when they looked up at the stars or across the valley. Something about these patterns suggests they were mapping something, even if it wasn't a map in the way we think of one today. There's a feeling here that goes beyond archaeology. Most of the time, when carvings survive this long, they're tucked deep inside cliffs or inside caves where rain and wind can't reach them. But these carvings have survived out in the open. That alone makes them intriguing. It suggests steady use or regular visitation long after they were made, as if different generations kept returning to them, touching them, maybe even refreshing or reinterpreting the shapes. You can almost picture small groups gathering around the rock at night, firelight bouncing over the stone, someone explaining these symbols to the next generation. Researchers have tried matching the shapes to known patterns from nearby indigenous cultures. Some similarities line up with the southeastern ceremonial complex, especially the idea of circles as a symbol of cycles, movement, or the universe. But there's no direct connection that solves the whole puzzle. The people who carved this weren't writing in a language that survived. They lived, told their stories, built their world, and then time swept most of it away. What's interesting is how the carvings are arranged. They don't feel random. One cluster sits toward the top of the rock, another near the lower edge, and each grouping has just enough variation to hint that they may have been made across different periods. Maybe the stone was a kind of community board, a place where each generation left a small mark, or maybe it was part of a larger ceremonial landscape that hasn't fully survived. It's hard to know, but when you stand there long enough, the carvings almost seem to draw you into that speculation. The first time I visited, I remember feeling surprised by how quiet the spot was. Even though the mill area gets plenty of foot traffic, not many people wander over to the carvings themselves unless they already know what they're looking for. The rock sits slightly off the path, surrounded by trees that create this natural alcove. Sunlight filters through the branches and lands on the stone at different angles throughout the day. When the light hits just right, the circles show up more clearly, almost like they've been waiting for the right moment to be seen. It's easy to imagine ancient hands carving these marks one line at a time, maybe with stone tools or sharpened pieces of bone, slowly etching out something they believed would matter long after they walked away. One detail that stands out is the weathering. The carved lines aren't sharp anymore, they've softened with time. That smoothing reminds you just how long these marks have been here. Rain, wind, sun, all of it has been working on this stone for centuries, yet the designs remain. There's something moving about that persistence. It adds a human layer to the site, a reminder that no matter who carved these patterns, they wanted them to last. Some theories drift more into the speculative: star maps, fertility symbols, hunting markers, or even early boundary indicators. The truth is, any of those could be possible. In the ancient Southeast, cosmology played a major role in daily life. People didn't see the land and sky as separate. Everything was connected. A circle wasn't just a shape. It was a reminder that life moved in patterns: birth, death, seasons, migrations. If the carvings had anything to do with observing the sky or tracking time, it would have made perfect sense for them to be placed somewhere easy to return to. There's also the idea that the stone itself mattered. In indigenous traditions across North America, certain rocks or hills were believed to have energy or presence. Sometimes a place became sacred simply because people felt something there. Maybe the stone at Hagood Mill had that effect. Maybe someone sat on it, felt it warm in the sun, and decided it was the right canvas for their symbols. Over time, the meaning could have grown, shifting from art to tradition, from tradition to ritual. What makes the mystery deeper is that these carvings don't stand alone. The surrounding region has scattered petroglyph sites, but none look exactly like the Hagood Mill panel. That uniqueness suggests a local group with specific beliefs or practices. It also means that whatever story the carvings once conveyed, it wasn't recorded anywhere else. You're looking at something that may only exist here and nowhere else on Earth. In recent years, efforts have been made to protect the carvings. Visitors are asked not to touch them, since even a few careless moments can damage the surface. The site now has a bit more structure, with signage and explanations, but it doesn't spoil the atmosphere. If anything, it gives you space to stand there and let the carvings speak for themselves. The nearby sound of water and the rustling leaves help set the tone. Even when people pass by chatting or taking photos, the rock holds on to its quiet. When you wrap up a visit and walk back toward the mill, there's this shift from the ancient to the historic. The old mill wheel, the wooden structures, the demonstrations of traditional crafts, they all remind you how many layers of human history are packed into one place. And then tucked behind it all is that stone. It's easy to overlook, but once you've seen it, it sticks with you. Not because the carvings answer anything, but because they raise new questions. Today, the carvings are still open to the public, still exposed to weather, still sitting exactly where ancient hands carved them. You can visit them, take your time, stand as close as you're allowed, and try to make sense of what you're seeing. Some people come away convinced the carvings hold messages we just haven't decoded yet. Others see them as practical markings tied to early communities. I tend to fall somewhere in between. They feel intentional but also humble, like someone wanted to leave a mark without demanding attention. Whatever their purpose, the Hagood Mill rock carvings add a quiet weight to the landscape. They're subtle but powerful once you spend enough time with them. They remind you that the ground beneath your feet carries stories far older than the buildings around it. And even though we may never fully understand the meaning carved into that stone, visiting the site gives you a sense of connection to the people who once stood there, shaping those lines under the same sky. The Sewee shell mounds. If you head out toward the salt marshes along South Carolina's central coast, there's a point where the modern world fades just enough that you can almost picture what this shoreline looked like before roads, houses, or anything built by European settlers. The air gets thicker with brine, the wind carries the sound of distant birds, and the marsh grass moves in slow, steady waves. Somewhere in that landscape sit the Sewee shell mounds. Quiet, weathered, and easy to miss unless you know what you're looking for. They don't rise like classic burial mounds or call out attention. Instead, they blend into the earth, disguised as small hills of oyster shells and soil, shaped over centuries by hands long gone. When you reach one of these mounds, the first thing you notice is the ground crunching under your feet. At a glance, it just looks like old oyster shells scattered everywhere. But the more you look, the more you realize you're walking over thousands of years of human life. These shells aren't random trash piles, they're intentional. The Sewee people built them layer by layer, generation after generation, until they formed massive earthworks that still sit here today despite storms, tides, and erosion. It's hard not to wonder what these mounds meant to the people who built them. Were they ceremonial? Were they villages? Were they something in between? Every theory has evidence, but none of them answer the mystery completely. The Sewee were known as strong coastal traders before European contact, and the region where these mounds sit once supported a big, thriving indigenous population. It makes sense. Food was abundant, water routes connected communities, and the land had natural protection. If you stand on one of the larger mounds, the view stretches across miles of marsh. You can imagine canoes drifting through those channels, families gathering along the edges, fires cracking at night. These mounds weren't built overnight. They took centuries of steady life, harvesting oysters, gathering fish, preparing meals, holding ceremonies. Everything left a trace. One theory sees the mounds as long-term settlement platforms. The ground in this region floods easily, especially during storms or high tides. A raised platform made from shells would have given the Sewee a dry, stable foundation to build on. When you run your hand across the shell layers, it's easy to see how tightly packed everything is. The shells weren't dumped randomly, they were layered with intention. Even today, the ground feels solid underfoot. If the goal was to create a reliable home base in a wet landscape, it worked. The mounds have held up longer than most modern houses. Another interpretation focuses on ceremony. In many coastal cultures, shells weren't just leftovers from meals, they were symbols of cycles, renewal, and connection to the water. Shell rings and mounds often appear in places with spiritual meaning. If that's the case here, then the Sewee shell mounds might have served as gathering areas for rituals, storytelling, and seasonal rites tied to the ocean and the moon. When you stand in the middle of these mounds, the natural quiet feels almost intentional, like the place was designed to keep sounds soft and thoughts focused. But the biggest mystery is the scale. Some of the Sewee mounds are surprisingly large, bigger than anything that would be needed just to handle daily waste. Archaeologists have uncovered fire pits, tools, pottery pieces, and animal bones in different layers, which suggests the mounds served multiple purposes. One layer might reflect a feast, another a building period, another a season of hardship. If you study the shells closely, you can see shifts in size and type. Large oysters dominate some sections, while smaller ones appear elsewhere. That change hints at environmental shifts, overharvesting, or even cultural changes over time. There's also the question of how much of the original structure still survives. Coastal erosion has eaten away at a large part of the Sewee homeland. What's left today is only a fraction of the original landscape. Some mounds have collapsed into the marsh, while others sit partly exposed. It's a strange feeling standing in front of something ancient, knowing most of it is already gone, swallowed by rising water or buried under centuries of soil. At the same time, what remains feels incredibly resilient. Even broken, the mounds still tell a story. The first time I visited, the thing that stuck with me wasn't the history but the quiet. The marsh around the site absorbs sound in a way that makes small noises stand out. An egret lifting off, the splash of a fish, the wind moving through reeds. When you're standing on one of the mounds, you feel a bit separated from everything else, almost like the mound creates its own space. The shells glint faintly in the sunlight, some bleached white, others weathered into a gray that matches the mud. It's not a dramatic sight, but it feels grounding. You start thinking about the people who once walked the same spot, carrying baskets of oysters, calling to each other across the water, going about their daily lives while building up something that would outlast them all. A question that often comes up is whether the Sewee built all the mounds themselves, or inherited some from earlier cultures. Evidence suggests a long span of use, possibly longer than the historical Sewee alone. That's part of what makes these structures so compelling. They might represent several layers of cultural history, each group adding its own touch, each generation shaping the land without erasing what came before. When you look at the cross-sections exposed in eroded areas, those layers feel like pages in a book no one can fully read anymore. There's also a haunting element to these mounds because of what happened to the Sewee people after European arrival. Their population declined rapidly due to disease, conflict, and displacement. The stories that once explained these mounds, why they were built, what they meant, how they were used, didn't get recorded in ways that survived. That silence makes the earthworks feel heavier. They represent not just daily life but a vanished world whose voice barely made it into the written record. Today, visiting the mounds isn't like visiting a polished historic site with plaques and clear trails. Some areas are protected and marked, but a lot of the landscape still feels raw. The ground can be uneven, especially after rain, and the marsh water sometimes creeps close. Despite that, or maybe because of it, the site feels authentic. Nothing about it is dressed up. You're seeing the place almost the way the Sewee would have seen it. Open, quiet, windswept, full of subtle beauty. As with many ancient sites in the southeast, preservation is a challenge. Rising sea levels, storms, and erosion are constant threats. Each year, more of the original structure disappears. Efforts have been made to stabilize certain areas, but the natural forces shaping the coast never stop. There's a bittersweet feeling in that reality. These mounds survived thousands of years, but their future is uncertain. Visiting them now feels like visiting something on the edge of time, still standing but slowly returning to the earth. If you take a moment to sit on the higher sections of the mounds, you get a sense of why people chose this place. The view is wide and peaceful. The breeze carries the same salt smell it must have carried centuries ago. Birds move in patterns that haven't changed since the first people arrived here. It's one of those rare spots where the past doesn't feel distant. It feels layered over the present, like you're momentarily sharing space with something ancient. Today, the Sewee shell mounds are still accessible, though some sections require care to approach. If you go, you'll find a landscape that isn't polished or overly controlled. It's quiet, reflective, and shaped by both culture and nature. The mounds are weathered but still full of presence. Some people walk away feeling like they've visited a forgotten chapter of coastal history. Others focus on the environmental side, noting how the marsh continues to reclaim what was built. Personally, I think the site carries both truths at once. It's a reminder of how people adapt to the land, and how the land eventually shapes everything in return. Whatever the original purpose of the Sewee shell mounds, home, ceremony, community, or something more symbolic, they stand today as one of the most intriguing remnants of ancient life on the South Carolina coast. And even though time has worn them down, the quiet weight of the place stays with you long after you step back onto the trail. The PD Cultural Mound Sites. If you follow the rivers that run through South Carolina's inland plains, you eventually reach stretches of land that feel older than anything around them. The air gets heavy with the smell of wet soil, the trees open into long, quiet clearings, and the landscape starts to show small rises, mounds that don't look like much at first glance. These are part of what archaeologists call the PD Cultural Mound Sites, scattered across the region where the PD people lived long before the English arrived. Most of these mounds sit hidden on private land, or tucked behind stretches of forest that only hunters and locals wander through. They aren't famous the way other ancient mounds in America are, but that almost makes them more mysterious. Their stories survive mostly in fragments, buried under centuries of leaves, soil, and silence. Standing near one of these mounds, the first thing you notice is how subtle they are. They're not towering pyramids or massive earthworks. Many look like gentle rises in the ground until you get close enough to see how symmetrical they are. A naturally formed hill doesn't form such clean lines. A human-made mound, even after 1,000 years of erosion, still has a quiet order to it. The soil feels different too, denser, more compacted, as if layers of earth were brought in over time rather than shaped by wind and water. Bend down and look closely, and sometimes you can see tiny pieces of pottery or broken stone tools that hint at a thriving culture long before this land turned into farms and timber fields. The PD people were known for building ceremonial centers, and their strongest ties lead back to the Town Creek Indian Mound just over the border in North Carolina. Town Creek is the one site that's been fully excavated and restored, and it gives clues to what the South Carolina mounds once looked like before time wore them down. Imagine a central mound topped with a council house or temple, surrounded by smaller mounds and open plazas where people gathered, fires burned at night, games, dances, and ceremonies played out across the ground. The river nearby supplied everything: food, travel, trade routes, and the spiritual meaning that tied the community together. If Town Creek is the best known example, then the PD mounds scattered across South Carolina were likely part of a much broader cultural network. But unlike Town Creek, most of the PD mounds in South Carolina haven't been excavated. They survive as quiet, unstudied pieces of landscape. That makes them compelling. Without formal digs, each mound is like a sealed time capsule. No one knows exactly what lies inside: burial chambers, ceremonial platforms, community structures, or simply raised spaces for gatherings. Every mound starts with the same question: who built it and why here? The PD culture thrived along rivers, so location wasn't random. A mound next to a bend in the river may have marked a sacred point in the landscape. Another built near a confluence might have been tied to seasonal gatherings or trade. Others could have been burial sites holding leaders or respected community members. Without excavation, all those possibilities hover in the air when you're standing there. The environment around the mounds adds another layer to the mystery. This part of South Carolina is full of broad fields, dense woods, and old river channels that twist and turn like veins. When you walk through the trees and stumble onto one of these mounds, the experience feels a bit surreal. There's no sign, no plaque, nothing to announce the significance of what you're seeing. It's just a rise in the ground in the middle of nowhere. But when you pause, the silence hits you in a specific way. These places feel like they were meant for gatherings, not solitude. The wind through the branches almost feels louder than it should be. The distant call of a bird echoes a little longer. It's easy to picture the sound of voices filling this clearing centuries ago. One thing that adds to the intrigue is how consistent the Piri were in their mound construction. Even without excavation, you can see patterns. Most mounds sit near water. Most have a similar height range, only a few feet above the surrounding ground, but large enough to notice once you're standing on them. Some are paired with smaller nearby rises, maybe satellite mounds or platforms. Others sit alone, which raises questions. Were they isolated ceremonial sites? Were they abandoned early? Did they belong to small family groups or migrating bands? Each mound tells a different story just by where it's placed and how big it is. The PD people were known for intricate pottery, Smooth surfaces, precise shapes, and stamped designs that show incredible craftsmanship. Whenever archaeologists find shards in the soil around these mounds, it feels like catching a whisper of the people who once lived here. You can picture hands working clay, engraving patterns, firing pots, carrying them between different settlements. Some pottery pieces link distant communities, showing that the Piri were part of a much larger network of trade and communication running through the southeast. So when you see pottery fragments near a South Carolina mound, it hints at how connected this site once was. There's also the spiritual side. In other southeastern cultures, mound-top buildings weren't just community centers. They held deep religious significance. Leaders met there, rituals were carried out, stories were passed down, and people honored ancestors. If the PD mounds in South Carolina followed similar patterns, each one might represent a sacred point in the landscape. Some archaeologists think the mounds lined up with seasonal changes, aligning with the sun at certain times of the year. Without excavations, it's impossible to confirm, but the idea adds another dimension to these quiet earthworks. Standing on a mound as the sun sets, watching the light stretch across the ground, it's easy to imagine early communities gathering here to mark important moments in time. When I visited one of these mounds for the first time, what struck me most was how ordinary the setting looked. Just a field bordered by trees, sunlight falling through the branches, patches of wild grass moving gently with the breeze. But the moment you step onto the mound itself, there's a slight shift. The air feels stiller, the ground feels firmer. You realize you're standing on something shaped by people who lived entirely differently from anyone alive today. They built this mound not for their lifetime alone, but for generations that would come after. That kind of long-term thinking leaves an emotional weight on the landscape. You feel it as you stand there, almost like you're stepping into a memory that doesn't belong to you. Today, the PD cultural mound sites are scattered and mostly unmarked. Some sit on private land and are known only to landowners and researchers. Others are hidden deep in wooded areas where only careful eyes can pick out the unnatural rise in the earth. A few have been lightly studied, but most remain untouched. That makes visiting them a strange mix of excitement and caution. These aren't polished historic parks. They're quiet, fragile pieces of ancient history. Anyone visiting has to tread lightly, knowing that each step lands on layers of soil transformed by human hands 1,000 years ago. Despite their quiet presence, the mounds continue to draw interest. Researchers hope future studies will reveal how they were built, who was buried in them, and how they fit into the broader history of the Southeast. But there's also a sense that leaving some untouched preserves their mystery. Not every ancient site needs to be fully opened. Some stories can stay partly hidden, as long as the land stays protected. Today, if you walk through the fields and woods where the PD mounds stand, you'll find a landscape shaped by farming, storms, and time. But the mounds remain, softened by erosion, yet still carrying the outline of a lost world. Some visitors feel a sense of peace here, others sense the weight of everything that's missing from the historical record. My own reaction sits somewhere in the middle. There's comfort in seeing something that's lasted this long, even in such a quiet form. But there's also that lingering curiosity. What did these mounds mean to the people who built them? And how much of that meaning survives in ways we can still feel even if we can't fully explain it? Whatever the original purpose, ceremonial, political, spiritual, or even practical, the PD cultural mound sites remain some of the most intriguing and least understood ancient features in South Carolina. They sit quietly in the landscape, holding their stories close, waiting for those who take the time to notice the rise of earth under their feet and wonder who once stood in that exact spot, looking out across the river under the same sky. The Spanish Mount Shell Midden at Edisto. If you spend enough time wandering the quieter parts of Hilton Head Island, you eventually come across spots where the modern world doesn't quite reach. Beyond the resorts, the golf courses, and the crowded beaches, the island still holds pockets where the forest closes in, the air cools under live oak canopies, and you start to notice subtle rises beneath the leaves. At first, they don't look like anything special, just uneven ground shaped by roots or erosion. But the longer you stand there, the more you realize the curve is too smooth and the circle too deliberate. Beneath the soil lies one of the most unusual and oldest forms of ancient architecture in North America, the prehistoric shell rings of Hilton Head Island. These rings might not look dramatic compared to grand ruins or towering mounds, but they're some of the most puzzling ancient structures in the Southeast. Dating back nearly 4,000 years, they were built by people with no written language, no metal tools, and no large villages as we think of them today. Yet they managed to shape enormous circular formations with surprising precision. They didn't leave behind explanations. They didn't carve symbols or bury artifacts that clearly outline their purpose. Instead, they left rings of oyster, clam, and whelk shells arranged in wide arcs that still hold their shape long after their makers disappeared. When you approach one, the first sensation is that the site feels older than anything else around it. The forest grows differently here. Live oaks twist themselves above the ring like guardians, Spanish moss trailing from their branches like slow-moving curtains. The floor beneath your feet shifts from soft leaf litter to scattered shells, some cracked, some still whole. These shells aren't scattered randomly. They form a pattern, wide, circular, and unmistakably intentional once you recognize the shape. Walking the perimeter gives you a strange sense of stepping inside something built with purpose, even if that purpose remains unknown. The most common interpretation is that the rings were early villages. The circular shape might have been the layout of homes arranged around a central plaza, and over years of meals, gatherings, and daily life, the discarded shells piled up and formed a ring. It's a simple explanation, but not a perfect one. If these rings were just the leftovers of daily life, why are the shapes so symmetrical? Why are some parts built higher than others? Why did the same pattern appear in so many places across the Carolina and Georgia coasts? And why were some rings left completely intact when the people who built them moved on? Standing in the center of a ring, it's easy to imagine what daily life might have looked like. Fires burning close to the ground, families preparing seafood along the edges, children running across the sand, water always within reach. The ring would have created a sense of enclosure, almost like the earliest example of a neighborhood layout. But then you step back and look at the height of the shell walls, some rising taller than a person originally, and the idea of a purely practical settlement starts to feel incomplete. Another theory suggests these rings were ceremonial spaces. In many coastal cultures, shells symbolized renewal, cycles, and the power of water. Building a ring of shells might have represented a connection to the tides or seasons. Some researchers think the rings aligned with celestial events or tidal patterns. Walking around them, you can picture gatherings happening here during certain times of year, feasts, rituals, or celebrations tied to the ocean. The curved form might have amplified sound or created a boundary between sacred and everyday space. What adds to the mystery is that inside the ring, the ground is usually lower than the surrounding earthwork. Some sections even appear intentionally cleared. If it was a simple trash heap, why keep the center so clean? And why do some rings have distinct entry points? Questions like these make the shell rings feel more like intentional architecture than accidental formations. One ring on Hilton Head is particularly striking because of how well it's preserved. When you stand on its arc, the structure feels almost like a ghostly foundation of something long gone. The shells are packed so tightly that the soil between them has fused into a kind of ancient concrete. You can run your hand along the surface and feel the rough texture of shells placed there thousands of years before modern roads or buildings existed. Even with erosion softening the edges, the ring still holds its curve as though the builders expected it to last. The coastal setting adds a layer of atmosphere you can't ignore. These rings sit in areas where the wind carries a steady scent of salt, birds call from the marsh, and the air feels thick in summer. When you stand within the ring, the sound shifts slightly. The trees block some of the wind, and the air settles. It gives the center an almost sheltered feeling, something you can sense even without fully understanding why. The environment allows you to imagine the ring as a gathering space, a place where voices might have carried and fires would have glowed at dusk. A lesser-known idea suggests the rings were seasonal encampments tied to oyster harvesting. The people who lived here were skilled at reading tides, currents, and the seasonal rhythm of shellfish growth. They might have built rings as temporary structures during peak harvesting times, returning year after year, and adding new layers of shells each season. The predictability of the ocean would have shaped their year. The structure of the ring could have helped them control flooding or mark areas for specific communal activities. But the biggest question remains not why the rings were built, but why the culture that created them disappeared. Around 3,000 years ago, the builders of these rings stopped creating them entirely. It wasn't gradual, it was sudden. The pattern that defined dozens of sites across the southeast ended almost overnight. Did environmental changes push people inland? Did their culture shift into something new? Or did some major event wipe out or disperse the population? The ring on Hilton Head stands quiet on its forested patch of land, but the silence carries a sense of something unfinished, like the final chapter of a story no one wrote down. Walking around the Hilton Head rings today, You'll notice the balance between nature reclaiming the site and the rings still resisting. In some areas, tree roots have worked themselves deep into the shell layers, splitting the structure slowly over time. In other spots, the shell arc rises so clearly from the ground that it feels untouched. Sunlight falls through the moss in broken patterns, lighting pieces of white and gray shell that have survived hundreds of seasons of storms. Visiting these rings feels different from visiting other ancient places. There's no museum energy or curated path leading you through the story. Instead, the site invites you to stand there quietly and imagine possibilities. The shells underfoot crack softly, and every sound seems sharper inside the circle. You feel a mix of curiosity and a kind of calm, like you've stepped into a space that was built for moments of gathering and reflection. You can sense that people once lived full lives here, shaped by the ocean, tied to its rhythm, leaving behind something that still speaks even without words. Today, the prehistoric shell rings of Hilton Head are protected, but they aren't heavily promoted. They sit in their quiet spaces, surrounded by forests and development that came long after the original builders vanished. The contrast is striking. Modern vacation life just minutes away from one of the oldest human-made structures in North America. Some visitors say the rings feel peaceful. Others say they feel lonely. For me, they feel like a reminder that people were reading this landscape thousands of years before anyone living now arrived, shaping it in ways that still hold their form. Their purpose may never be fully proven. Maybe they were villages, maybe sacred spaces, maybe calendars made from earth and shell, maybe something we haven't even considered. But standing there, with the wind moving through the live oaks and the shells glinting faintly beneath the leaves, you feel the presence of a culture that understood this coast deeply and left behind a quiet circle of clues.